time
probe
for
came
hesitation
back
is
with
over.
numbers.
We must unite now.
That was
stand
how
ready,
it
leader.
always started
Our
for
destiny
the
awaits
Vroth.
among the stars.
Numbers, atmospheric density, gravity index, biological threat level, estimated resource value. Numbers decided everything. Numbers told you which worlds were worth taking and which ones were worth ignoring. Survey technician Os pulled the data from the probe and read through it at his station aboard the patrol vessel Crimson Fang. The ship was 3 days into a routine border sweep, charting the edge of unmapped space. His job was simple: read the numbers, file the report, move on. The planet in question had no name, just a catalog number. It was the third world orbiting a medium yellow star near the outer rim of what the Vroth called the Dead Fringe, a stretch of space so far from anything useful that no empire had ever bothered to claim it. Os read the numbers. Gravity was 1.2 standard, high but not unusual. Atmospheric composition was oxygen-nitrogen with trace gases. Breathable, technically. Surface temperature ranged from -50 to +48 depending on region and season. Violent swings. The weather system data showed continuous storm cycles across 3 of the 7 major landmasses. The ocean coverage was over 70%. Then the biological data came through. I stared at it for a long moment. The megafauna readings were unlike anything in his database. Not just large, dense, layered, predator and prey in numbers that suggested an ecosystem under constant violent pressure. The probe had recorded audio in one region, and the sound file alone was enough to make him turn the volume down halfway through. Something enormous had screamed at the drone. Then something larger had screamed back. He flagged one sub-entry that the probe had captured in a temperate zone near the northern landmass. Small bipedal creatures, warm-blooded, moving in coordinated groups across open terrain. The probe estimated population density in that zone at several thousand individuals across a few hundred square kilometers. He almost added a note to the file, something about the coordination pattern looking unusual. The way the small creatures moved suggested communication, not just instinct. They were carrying things, dragging materials, building maybe. He looked at the note he was about to add. Then he looked at the rest of the data. Gravity too high for comfortable Vroth deployment. Weather systems too unstable for surface operations. No detectable metals of value in shallow crust. No energy signatures suggesting existing infrastructure worth taking. The biological threat index alone would require a full suppression fleet just to make ground operations viable. The numbers said, not worth it. Os deleted the note about the bipedal creatures. He filed the planet under Class D hostile environment. No strategic or economic value. Recommended status, ignore. He submitted the report and moved on to the next catalog entry. Commander Drac reviewed the day's survey batch that evening in his quarters. He was a broad-shouldered Vroth with old scars running along the left side of his neck from a suppression campaign on Gorathi 7-8 years ago. He had been leading patrol sweeps for 15 years. He had seen 10,000 survey reports. They all looked the same after a while. He skimmed the Class D entry without stopping. The Crimson Fang moved on. 3 weeks later, Os was back at his station doing the same job for a different stretch of space. He had forgotten about the oxygen-nitrogen planet entirely. There were always more planets. The galaxy was full of them. But the probe data remained in the archive, filed correctly, tagged and stored. Every reading the drone had taken was preserved in the Vroth survey database, including the one file Os had decided not to flag. A single 3-second audio clip from the temperate northern zone. In it, underneath the wind and the distant animal sounds, there was something else. A pattern, short, repeated, deliberate, not a call, not a threat display, something more organized than either of those things. The probe had not been sophisticated enough to identify it. If it had been, the Vroth might have made a very different decision that day. The pattern in the audio was the sound of two small creatures exchanging information. One was pointing toward a ridge. The other was responding. They had just agreed on where to go next. They were talking, but the numbers had already decided, and no one was listening to 3-second audio files from planets flagged as not worth it. The Crimson Fang completed its sweep and returned to the nearest Vroth staging post at the edge of the dead fringe. Drac filed his route report. Os filed his survey batch. Both of them went to the mess hall and ate their evening rations and talked about nothing important. The yellow star behind them continued to burn. The blue-green world continued to spin. And on the northern landmass of that unnamed planet, in a shallow valley near a river that would one day have a name, a small group of bipedal creatures sat around a fire they had made on purpose. They were looking up at the sky. One of them pointed at a moving light passing slowly overhead and said something to the others. The others looked. Someone responded. There was a short exchange. Then they went back to the fire. They had no word yet for spaceship. But they were curious. They were always curious. That was the thing about them. The Vroth probe had measured everything worth measuring and found nothing worth noting. It had not measured curiosity. That was the first mistake. The first thing Preth noticed was the doors. Every sealed door on the station had been opened. Not forced, not cut, opened. The locking mechanisms on Vroth border stations were rated for industrial-grade breach attempts. They required either command-level authorization codes or specialized cutting equipment that took several minutes per door. Whatever had moved through Station Yurak 9 had opened 14 sealed doors without codes and without cutting equipment. Preth walked the corridor slowly, alone except for his recorder. He was a thin Vroth with pale gray scales and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging details. He had spent 20 years in the Internal Bureau investigating things that did not make sense. He was good at it because he did not panic and he did not assume. He assumed nothing now. Station Yurak 9 had gone silent 11 days ago. No distress signal, no explosion, no debris field. The response team that arrived first found the station intact, power running, all systems functional, just empty. 43 Vroth crew gone, every personal item left behind. Food still on the table in the mess hall, partially eaten. One corrupted security file. Preth had watched that file 40 times before coming here. It lasted 9 seconds. The image quality was poor, degraded by whatever had interfered with the station's recording system. But the shape was there. Tall, roughly bipedal, moving through the corridor at the far end of frame with calm and deliberate steps. No weapons visible. No equipment visible except the suit, which was dark and fitted close to the body. The figure did not run, did not hesitate. It walked to the sealed door at the end of the corridor and the door opened and it went through. 9 seconds. Then the file ended. Preth crouched near the door mechanism on the 5th corridor. He examined the surface with a light. No scratches, no heat marks, no sign of forced entry of any kind. He took a surface scan and found trace residue of a material he did not recognize, a polymer compound with no match in the Vroth materials database. He filed the scan and kept walking. What made Preth's skin feel wrong was not the missing crew. Disappearances happened. Pirates, rogue factions, internal breakdowns. There were explanations. What made his skin feel wrong was the organization of it. Nothing was ransacked. Nothing of military value had been taken. The weapons locker was intact. The fuel reserves were untouched. The communication equipment was undamaged but offline, disabled cleanly from the inside. Whoever this was, they had not come to take anything. Preth did not yet know what they had come for. The answer arrived 6 weeks later from a completely different direction. A Gorathi cargo hauler was found drifting in the Sulhari trade corridor, engines cold, running on backup power. Preth was routed the report because of the open investigation. He read it on his way to the recovery site. 14 Gorathi crew, all alive, all unharmed, all wrapped in an unfamiliar silver-gray thermal material. The ship had been in transit with a load of Gorathi tribute goods, the kind the Vroth collected from subjugated species. 2 weeks overdue, which was why a patrol had gone looking. Preth interviewed Ren first, the oldest of the Gorathi crew. A weathered elder with clouded eyes, who sat very still in the medical bay of the recovery vessel. He asked Ren what happened. Ren was quiet for a moment. Then he said they had been boarded, 3 of the beings, tall, upright faces covered by helmets with dark visors. They moved through the ship very fast and without sound. The Gorathi crew had been terrified. They expected to be killed or taken. Instead, the beings had disarmed the Vroth monitoring equipment on board. All of it. Every tracking beacon, every communication tapped the Vroth installed on Gorathi vessels as standard practice. Then they had distributed food. Preth asked Ren to repeat that. Ren said it again. The beings brought food, not Gorathi food, their own food from their own supplies, wrapped packages with no markings Ren could read. They gave one to each crew member. One of the beings crouched down next to a young Gorathi with a broken arm, an injury from earlier in the voyage, and wrapped it properly with a rigid brace and soft padding. The young one had flinched away, and the being had stopped and waited and then continued very slowly and carefully until the arm was set. Then the beings had left. They took nothing. They left the cargo. They left the ship. They had not spoken any language Ren recognized, but one of them, before leaving, had touched 2 fingers to the side of its helmet and held them toward Ren for a moment. Ren did not know what it meant, but he had held up 2 fingers the same way as the being left, because it seemed like the right thing to do. Preth sat with this information for a long time. He had 2 incidents now. One where 43 Vroth crew disappeared without a trace. One where 14 Gorathi slaves were freed from Vroth monitoring, fed, and medically treated by the same category of unknown beings. He began to think the 43 Vroth crew were not dead. He began to think they were somewhere being fed and medically treated as well. That thought was somehow more unsettling than the alternative. He filed his expanded report and requested access to all Class D survey data from the dead fringe region over the past 60 years. He had a feeling he was looking for a planet that someone had decided was not worth nodding. Liz had been running the same trade route for 9 years without incident. She knew which patrol corridors the Vroth used and when. She knew which checkpoints ran slow and which ran fast. She knew how to file her cargo manifest in the format that Vroth inspectors process quickest, so they waved her through without a secondary scan. 9 years of small, careful decisions had kept her ship intact and her crew alive. The unknown vessel that came alongside her near the Solhari outer marker did not match any profile she had on file. It was not Vroth. The lines were wrong. Too rounded, too practical. No weapon ports visible on the hull, which was either reassuring or a sign that the weapons were internal, which was worse. It was slightly larger than her own ship, and it was moving to match her speed without any prior communication. Liz did what she always did when she did not understand a situation. She waited. The communication request came through on a standard open frequency. Liz looked at her crew, a total of 5 Solhari in the small bridge, and they all looked back at her with the wide, reflective eyes of their species showing varying degrees of fear. She accepted the request. The voice that came through was not Vroth. It was a different sound entirely, rounder and softer, and it spoke in badly accented but recognizable Solhari trade tongue. It said, "Hello, we mean no harm. We would like to ask if we can come aboard and speak with you. We have food we can bring. Also, we have medicine if anyone is sick." Liz stared at the speaker for a very long time. She asked who they were. The voice said, "We are from a planet called Earth. We are exploring. We are very glad to meet you." She did not grant docking rights immediately. She asked several more questions, some of which the voice answered well, and some of which it answered with honest confusion, which she found more reassuring than a confident answer would have been. She asked if they were working with the Vroth. The voice paused and then said, "No, we know about the Vroth. That is part of why we are out here." She granted docking rights. They came through the airlock, three of them, and Liz had to rearrange her understanding of the galaxy slightly when she saw them. They were not large, not by the standards of the species she knew. Average height, soft-skinned, no scales, no ridge structures, 2 arms, 2 legs, faces with small flat noses and eyes in 2 colors across the three of them, brown and gray and something close to green. They were carrying a container of food and a medical kit, and one of them was also carrying a small device that turned out to be a translator they had been building since intercepting Solhari communication signals for the past 8 months. The one who had spoken on the radio was a woman named Ava. She introduced the other two as Doru and Fen. Doru was quiet and kept looking around the ship with an expression of obvious curiosity. Fen immediately asked if anyone had any injuries or symptoms. Liz said no and watched them very carefully. They sat at the table in the small galley, and the food they brought turned out to be dense and slightly sweet and not unpleasant. Ava talked. She talked a great deal. She asked questions about trade routes and species populations and political structures, and she listened to every answer with complete attention, her hands folded on the table and her eyes on whoever was speaking. At some point, Liz realized the conversation had shifted. She had started asking questions back. She asked how many humans there were. Ava told her. The number was very large. Liz had not expected that. She asked where they had been. Ava described Earth, the high gravity and the weather and the long biological history, and Liz found herself sitting very still trying to imagine what kind of creature you had to become to survive a world like that for 10,000 generations. Then Liz, because she was tired and had been afraid for 9 years, and was sitting across from someone who seemed to genuinely want to listen, told Ava about the Vroth. She told her about the tribute system and the inspection stops, and the crew members who disappeared if they spoke in the wrong tone to the wrong officer. She told her about the Gorathi, who had tried to resist twice and had paid for it both times in ways that kept Solhari traders quiet at night. She told her about the 7 species currently under full Vroth subjugation, and the 3 more currently in the process of being absorbed, and the general understanding among everyone in this part of the galaxy that the smart thing was to be small and invisible and useful, and hoped the Vroth had larger problems elsewhere to deal with. Ava listened to all of it. When Liz finished, the table was quiet for a moment. Then Ava said, "How long has this been going on?" Liz said 300 years, maybe more for the older species. Ava was quiet again. Then she nodded once, the way someone nods when they have just decided something. Liz asked what she was thinking. Ava said, "I'm thinking we came out here at the right time." Doru, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, looked up from the notes he had been taking and said something to Ava in their own language. Ava responded briefly. Doru nodded and went back to his notes. Liz asked what he had said. Ava smiled a little. He said we're going to need a bigger ship. Liz did not entirely understand what that meant, but something about the way Ava said it made the weight in her chest feel, for the first time in 9 years, slightly lighter. Admiral Drac had burned 4 colonies in his career. He did not think of it in those terms. The official Vroth terminology was compliance enforcement action, which was a phrase that meant the same thing but sounded like administration. 4 colonies that had refused tribute payment or harbored resistance members or simply needed to be made into an example so that other colonies nearby remembered what the alternative looked like. The 5th one should have been routine. The Gorathi settlement on the moon designated Gorathi Outpost 12 had missed 3 consecutive tribute payments. The settlement was small, roughly 8,000 occupants, mostly families of mining workers. The Vroth fleet assigned to the action was 12 vessels, more than enough. Drac had brought the fleet personally because he was in the region, and because he had not overseen a compliance action in 2 years, and his commanders needed to see he was still willing to do what the Empire required. When the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the moon appeared on the forward displays, everything was normal. Then the scanner officer said, "Admiral, there are vessels already in orbit." Drac looked. 12 ships, positioned between the fleet and the moon in a formation he did not recognize. Not Vroth, not any configuration in his database. They were smaller than his cruisers, but the formation was not the loose, scattered pattern of pirates or the desperate clustering of inexperienced defenders. It was a deliberate line, evenly spaced, each ship angled to cover a sector. Whoever had arranged that formation had done it with someone who understood fleet geometry. Drac opened a hailing frequency and demanded identification. The response came back within seconds, which meant they had been watching for the fleet and had the channel ready. The voice spoke in clean Vroth trade tongue, which meant they had been studying the language, which meant this was not an accident. The voice belonged to a man named Roy. Roy said that the Gorathi settlement on the moon below was under humanitarian protection. He said that any action taken against the settlement or its occupants would be treated as an act of aggression and responded to accordingly. He said this without any particular anger or excitement. The way a person states facts they have already decided are not open to debate. Drac told Roy to move his ships or the Vroth fleet would move them. Roy said he understood and that the ships would not be moving. Drac fired a warning shot, not at the human vessels, into the space ahead of them. A standard deterrent round, the kind that left a visible energy bloom in the void and communicated clearly that the next shot would not be a warning. The human ships did not move. Drac waited. The human ships did not move. He ordered a direct strike on the lead vessel. Single hit, non-critical enough to damage without destroying. A show of seriousness. The lead human ship took the hit. Its hull plating glowed where the energy struck. Systems flickered visible on its running lights. It held position. Then it fired back. Not with one weapon, with a coordinated simultaneous discharge from 4 of the 12 ships targeting 3 of Drac's cruisers at once. The targeting was extremely precise, not aimed at drive systems or life support, aimed at weapon arrays. The 3 cruisers lost their primary forward armaments in under 8 seconds. Drac had been in fleet engagements for 30 years. He had never seen targeting that precise executed that fast. The remaining human ships held position. Roy's voice came back on the channel. He said the fleet's crew were unharmed and that this could stop here if Drac chose to withdraw. What followed was not a clean battle. Drac did not withdraw. He pushed forward with the remaining 9 ships and the humans responded, and the engagement lasted 40 minutes, and by the end of it Drac had 3 more ships disabled. One of his own cruisers had experienced a cascade failure in its reactor, housing from a strike that somehow knew exactly where the cooling junction was. And the human fleet had taken significant damage to 4 of their 12 vessels, but all 12 were still present and still holding the line. The moon below was untouched. Drac called a hold. He looked at the formation across from him. Damaged ships, running lights flickering on 2 of them, but the line had not broken. Not once in 40 minutes had any of the human ships retreated or broken formation or made any move that looked like panic. He thought about the targeting precision. He thought about the reactor strike. He thought about the fact that whoever designed this engagement had known the Vroth fleet layout well enough to neutralize the right systems in the right order. He pulled back, not in retreat, in assessment. On the bridge, his officers were quiet. Some of them were looking at him. Some of them were looking at the screens showing the human formation. His communications officer said the Gorathi settlement was transmitting on an open frequency. He asked if Drac wanted it blocked. Drac asked what they were transmitting. The officer said they were transmitting music. Drac stared at him. The officer said it again. The Gorathi settlement was playing music on an open frequency. It had started approximately 4 minutes ago, which was approximately when the human ships had held the line and the Vroth advance had stopped. Drac sat down in his command chair for the first time in 40 minutes. He asked for everything the Vroth database had on the species called humans. Everything. Survey data, intelligence files, any contact reports, anything flagged from the dead fringe region. Whatever he was dealing with, he needed to understand it. He had a feeling understanding it was going to take a while. The report was 412 pages. Preth had spent 8 months building it. He had pulled every survey file, every intercepted communication, every second-hand account from freed Gorathi and nervous Solhari traders, and every scrap of data that the Vroth Empire had accidentally collected about a species it had decided was not worth nodding. He delivered it to Admiral Drac in person. Drac read for 3 hours without speaking. Preth sat across the room and waited. Outside the viewport, the fleet drifted in a holding pattern 3 systems from the moon they had failed to burn. When Drac put the report down, the room was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This planet, Earth, show me the original survey data." Preth pulled it up on the wall display. Gravity, atmosphere, temperature range, biological threat index, the audio file that had never been flagged. Drac listened to the 3-second audio clip, the wind, the animal sounds, the pattern underneath. He said, "That is language." Preth said yes. Drac said, "How long ago was this survey?" Preth said 42 years. Drac sat with that number for a moment. 42 years ago, a survey drone had recorded the sound of 2 beings exchanging information on the surface of a Class D world that the Vroth had decided was not worth the trouble. He picked up the report again and read a specific section out loud. The section concerned human evolutionary biology. Preth had worked with 2 captured Gorathi scholars to compile it from everything available. It described a species that had developed on a high-gravity world with no natural advantages. No claws, no armor, no venom, relatively poor night vision, slower than most of the megafauna they shared the planet with. They had survived not by outrunning their predators or out-armoring them, but by a combination of endurance, group coordination, and a cognitive drive toward problem-solving that had no recorded upper limit in any tested individual. They could run for longer than almost any other creature on their world. Not faster, longer, hours. They had hunted by chasing things until those things collapsed from exhaustion. That strategy required patience, communication, and the ability to look at something that had escaped you and decide to keep going anyway. They had a word for that decision. Preth had included it in the report. The word was persistence. They had also nearly destroyed their own planet. Preth had included this section carefully because he thought it was as important as any other part. The humans had come within measurable distance of ecological and nuclear catastrophe twice in their recorded history. They had generated sufficient weapons to sterilize their own world and had at several points come very close to using them. They had poisoned their atmosphere, their oceans, and large portions of their landmass through industrial activity. And then some of them had decided to fix it. Not all of them, not even most of them at first, but enough of them in enough places consistently enough over enough generations that the trajectory had bent. The weapons had not been used. The atmosphere had begun to recover. The species had not ended itself. Drac said, "They nearly destroyed themselves twice and they are still here." Preth said that was correct. Drac said, "And in the time between our survey and now, they developed faster-than-light travel, expanded to multiple systems, established trade and defense agreements with 11 other species, and fought my fleet to a draw." Preth said that was also correct. Drax set the report down and walked to the viewport. He stood there for a long time watching the stars. He said, "What do they want?" Preth said that was the section of the report he found most difficult to write, because the answer was strange. The humans did not appear to want territory, at least not primarily. They had expanded but into empty and unclaimed space. They had not attempted to take any Vroth-controlled worlds. They had not built an empire or established a tribute system or demanded anything from any of the species they had helped. What they appeared to want, as best as Preth could determine, was to make things better. It was not a strategy he had an existing framework for. He had included 37 documented instances of human intervention in the region over the past 6 years. Freed Gorathi slaves, Salhari traders whose ships had been seized and were returned anonymously, a Lethani colony that had suffered a crop failure and received 3 shipments of food from an unknown origin before humans had been publicly identified, a species called the Risu, previously unknown even to Vroth surveys, who had been found and catalogued by a human vessel, and then gently declined to be included in any formal political framework, and were instead just told where the nearest trade routes were. Drac turned from the viewport. He said, "They are building something, not an empire, something else." Preth said he believed that was correct. Drac said, "What is harder to fight than an empire?" Preth had thought about this question for 8 months. He had an answer. He said, "A reason." Drac looked at him. Preth said that an empire could be outmaneuvered. It had borders and logistics and command structures. You could cut the head off an empire and the body would slow. But the humans were not building a structure that required a head. They were building relationships, one species at a time, and every relationship was its own reason to continue. You could not cut the head off a reason. You could not blockade trust or bomb familiarity out of existence. Every species the humans had helped was now a species that knew the Vroth were not inevitable. That was the problem. Drac asked how many species currently had informal ties to human networks. Preth said 18 at last count, and the count had been 3 weeks ago. Drac picked up the report one more time. He turned to the last page. It was a note Preth had added himself, outside the formal structure of the document. It read, "We surveyed this world 42 years ago and found nothing worth noting. We were looking at the wrong numbers." Drac read it twice, then he closed the report. He asked Preth to leave him alone for a while. Preth left. He walked slowly down the corridor of the flagship, and he thought about 42 years and a 3-second audio file, and a probe that had measured everything except the thing that mattered. He thought that whatever came next was going to be very difficult. He also thought, privately, and in a place he would never put into a report, that perhaps it should be. The Vroth Council voted for war on a Tuesday. Nobody on the human side knew what a Tuesday was, but the declaration arrived in human-controlled space through 3 different channels simultaneously, which meant the Vroth had planned the delivery carefully, which meant they wanted the message to be unmistakably clear. The message was simple. Human expansion into Vroth-adjacent space was to cease immediately. All human vessels operating in the region were to withdraw. All agreements made with Vroth tributary species were to be dissolved. Failure to comply within 30 cycles would be treated as an act of open war. Ava read the declaration in the galley of the Ardent Steppe, which was now considerably less alone than it had been 3 years ago. The human presence in the region had grown. Not a military buildup in the traditional sense, no massing of warships in a single location, but a distributed network of vessels doing the same things they had always done. Trading, helping, showing up. She forwarded the declaration to the coordination network, and then made herself a drink and thought about it. The reply the Human Council sent back was brief. It said that human ships would not be withdrawing, that existing agreements with other species were voluntary arrangements and not subject to Vroth authorization, and that any action taken against human vessels or their allies would be responded to. The Vroth fleet came in force 31 cycles later. It was the largest military action the Empire had launched in 300 years. 60 warships in the lead element, with more staged at 3 positions further back. The kind of force that was meant to end a question permanently by making the cost of resistance obviously impossible. What the fleet found at the edge of human-adjacent space was not a human line. It was everyone. The Gorathi had converted 40 ore haulers. They were slow and ugly and not designed for combat, and they were there anyway, holding position on the outer edge of the formation. The Sulhari had contributed 9 vessels, small and fast, arranged in a screen pattern ahead of the main body. There were Lethani ships, angular and unfamiliar, that Vroth intelligence had not even known possessed drive systems capable of making this distance. There were 3 ships that Preth, watching the feed from a transport vessel at the back of the fleet, could not identify at all. And at the center, in a formation that Preth recognized from the engagement at Gorathi Outpost 12, were the human ships, more than 12 this time. The Vroth admiral commanding the fleet, a hardened commander named Voss, did not hesitate. He ordered an advance. The battle lasted 9 hours. Preth watched from the transport for the first 3 hours. Then he stopped watching because watching was making him feel something he had no name for, and it was interfering with his ability to think clearly. He walked to the small observation room at the rear of the transport and sat down and listened to the engagement reports coming in over the fleet communication channel. The Gorathi haulers took the first heavy hits and several of them broke apart, and Preth heard the count of casualties and felt the nameless feeling again. They had not been soldiers. They had been miners and workers and families that had decided, at some point in the past 3 years, that the Vroth were not inevitable, and they had showed up anyway in their ore haulers. The Sulhari screen held longer than anyone had expected. The human ships coordinated with them in real time, adapting formation as the Vroth pushed through, always moving, never letting the larger Vroth cruisers get a static target. The Lethani ships, it turned out, had weapons that nobody in the fleet had encountered before. 3 Vroth destroyers were disabled by something that disrupted drive systems at the molecular level and drifted out of the engagement unable to maneuver. The human ships were damaged, several badly. One went dark for 40 minutes and came back with half its systems offline and held position anyway. By hour 6, the Vroth fleet was a third smaller than it had been at the start. The coalition had lost more in raw numbers, but the line had not broken. Every time the Vroth found a gap, something filled it. Sometimes a Sulhari fast mover, sometimes a patched-together Gorathi hauler with one working weapon array, sometimes a human vessel that had no business being in that position but went there anyway. Voss called a withdrawal at hour 9. It was not a rout, it was a decision. The force remaining was still significant, but the math had stopped working. The coalition was absorbing losses and continuing. The Vroth fleet had expected the outer species to collapse when the pressure increased. They had not collapsed. They had compressed and held. Preth heard the withdrawal order and closed his eyes. He was still sitting in the observation room 2 hours later when the door opened, and 2 human soldiers came in and told him quietly that he was a prisoner of the coalition and that no harm would come to him. He did not resist. They took him to a different vessel, a human ship. He walked through clean, functional corridors and was brought to a small room and left there with water and a blanket and the kind of temporary dignity that people extended to someone they had beaten but not broken. An hour after that, Ava came in. She sat down across from him and put a tray of food on the table between them. Nothing elaborate, whatever the ship had. Preth looked at the food, then at her. She said, "You should eat." He asked why she was doing this. She said because he was probably hungry, and because there was no reason not to. He looked at the food for a long time. He thought about 42 years. He thought about a 3-second audio file. He thought about ore haulers that had no business being in a battle and were there anyway. He thought about a species that had almost destroyed itself twice and had decided, enough of them enough times, to try something else. He thought about the note he had written at the end of his report, the one about looking at the wrong numbers. He picked up the food and he ate. Ava did not talk much while he ate. She sat with him in the quiet and looked out the small viewport at the stars. When he finished, she asked if he wanted more. He said no. She nodded and stood and moved to leave. He said, "We ruled this region for 300 years. She stopped. He said, "We never understood what we were afraid of." Ava looked at him for a moment. She did not say anything triumphant. She did not say anything at all that sounded like winning. She said, "You still don't have to be." Then she left him there with the empty tray and the viewport full of stars and something in his chest that was entirely new and entirely without a name. Outside, somewhere in the dark between the systems, the coalition fleet was already moving, not in pursuit, not in conquest. Going to see if anyone needed help.